That night, the fence shifted. Nobody called the police. They called me. By sunrise, the land would be reclassified on paper, which meant the men arriving at dawn with measuring wheels and clipboards would be protected, and the people standing in their way would not. I'd trained for borders like this once, when orders were blunt and the other side wore a uniform. This time, the clock was a permit window. The rules were polite. Every side believed they were acting responsibly. That belief was the dangerous part. I was in the old logistics warehouse when Piero's call came through, my hands inside a breaker panel. The building sat above the village on a shoulder of rock and pine, a concrete shed left over from a different kind of urgency. Now, it was my civilian work. Keep the locks oiled, keep the generator willing, keep the place from sliding into ruin. I logged wind and snow in a notebook because paper didn't run out of battery. They moved it, Piero said, the fence. He didn't need to say which one. There was only one line in town argued over for as long as I'd been here. A run of mesh and rotted posts that marked where the old depot land ended and the pasture began. The depot was mine to maintain. Officially, the pasture belonged to everyone, which meant it belonged to the first person with a stamped document. "Are you up there?" he asked. "I'm up here," I said. Because it was true, and because truth is what you offer when you don't want to offer consent, come down. We're at the bend. The Conti people are here. Not machines. Papers. They said they're measuring at first light. I could have asked why he called me instead of the mayor. I could have said I wasn't responsible. Instead, I killed the power, closed the panel, and wrote the time in my notebook. A habit from maintenance. A habit from before that. When something changes in the dark, you want a timestamp before you want an argument. The road down was slick with old sleet. At the bend, headlights caught a fresh line of plastic mesh, bright as a warning vest, staked into ground that had always been left alone. It didn't look like an attack. It looked like compliance. People stood around it in a half moon, hands in pockets, shoulders raised against the cold. No one shouted. They were saving their voices for morning, when the official version would be easier to hear. A woman from the regional office was there. Not Elena herself, but one of her staff, holding a folder under her arm like a shield. Two men in reflective vests waited beside a van. The van door was open. Inside were a tripod and a long case. Clean equipment, clean boots, the kind of cleanliness that meant you hadn't stepped in our mud yet. Piero pointed at me as if I'd arrived with authority in my coat. I felt the old reflex to stand where I could see everyone's hands. I hated that reflex, and I used it anyway. "What happened?" I asked. To nobody in particular. The line moved. An older farmer said while we slept. "It's a temporary barrier for safety," the staff woman said. Still polite. "Tomorrow we measure. Then the classification updates. We're within the permit window. As if time was weather you could wait out." I looked at the stakes. Fresh. Driven deep. Placed not on the obvious boundary, but a step inside it, turning a strip of familiar ground into somebody else's buffer. Whoever set them knew exactly how to make the change feel small. I could have told the farmers to pull it up. I could have told the staff woman she was trespassing. I could have told everyone to go home before someone did something that would look terrible on video. All of those would have been decisions. So was saying nothing. In the end, I did what I always did when a system tried to become invisible. I walked the line. I knelt, ran my fingers over the disturbed soil, and checked the angle of the stakes. Then I stood and said, quietly, "If you measure at dawn, you'll have people standing here. If you bring protection for the men with clipboards, you should bring protection for the ones who live on this slope." Her smile tightened, as if I'd used a word out of turn. Piero watched me like I'd chosen a side. I told myself I was only stating facts, like wind speed, like the weight of snow on a roof. Neutral, professional, Driving back up, the notebook on the passenger seat felt heavier than it should have. I understood, with the calm disgust of someone recognizing a familiar trap, that neutrality was already in action. It just happened to be the easiest one to deny. In daylight, the plastic mesh looked even more ordinary, the way danger often does when you can see it clearly. The mountains were the same. The bend was the same. Only the line was different. And lines were what paperwork was made of. By 9, a notice had gone up on the bar door. Municipal update, 11:30. Community Hall. Someone had forwarded a PDF into the village WhatsApp group, the kind of document nobody reads until it hurts them. I printed it anyway. Paper was slower, and slower was sometimes safer. The letterhead was regional. The language was careful. Grid resilience. Winter load. Public safety. It mentioned an access easement granted years ago, buried in a paragraph full of commas that made it feel like a natural fact. It didn't mention the old depot by name. It referred to Parcel 17B, temporary safety barriers, and protected work windows. On the map, our bend was a neat curve, not a place where children waited for the bus. At 10, Elena Conti arrived. No convoy. A compact car. A young engineer with a rolled plan set. A local liaison I recognized from flood relief work. And 2 security men dressed like men who had learned to be invisible. Elena shook hands the way people do when they intend to remember you later as a line item. Gianni Riva, she said. Caretaker of the depot site. Caretaker, not resident. A man who maintained, therefore a man who could be asked to cooperate. I maintain it, I said. It was the smallest correction I could make without starting a fight. She accepted it as agreement. We're measuring today. The permit window is narrow. By tomorrow morning, the classification updates in the registry. After that, the crew is protected to work, and any obstruction becomes a different matter, protected. Obstruction. Different matter. She spoke like she was reading weather. At the hall, the room split the way it always split. Older people who wanted the ground to stay put. Younger ones who wanted compensation. A few who wanted the project because they were tired of broken roads and empty work. No one was a monster. No one was pure. Elena listened and kept returning to the same 3 words. Schedule. Safety. Law. She wasn't wrong. That was the trap. The liaison handed out a 1-page summary with Elena's signature at the bottom, and a phone number that would ring in an office far away. I had my hazard notes folded in my pocket. I could have opened them and turned my competence into a speech. Instead, I asked one question that fit their world. Who signs off on site-specific safety changes? I said. If the ground conditions don't match the plan. The engineer glanced at Elena. Relieved. We document, Elena said. We assess. If there's a verified hazard, we mitigate. But we don't stop the project because someone feels uneasy. Someone feels uneasy. She didn't mean it as an insult. She meant it as a category. A farmer called Luca asked, loudly, who would do the verifying? Elena's gaze didn't harden. It narrowed. Professional verified by evidence, she said. If you have it, submit it today. Not after the window closes. That was the procedural bargain in its cleanest form. Use the right channel in the right time and you will be heard. Miss either and you become obstruction. I looked at the faces around her. Some wanted her promise because they were tired. Some wanted a fight because they were scared. Most wanted someone else to carry the cost of choosing. I chose deferral. I did not hand Elena my notes in front of the room. I did not give the crowd a technical reason to harden into certainty. I told Elena I would walk the line with her engineer after the meeting, quietly, and show him what I'd seen. That way, the evidence would exist inside their process, and the village wouldn't have to become a mob to feel seen. Elena nodded once. as if I had finally behaved like a caretaker. When the meeting broke, people drifted into the bright cold with the same expressions they'd carried in. The only thing that had changed was that we now had an official time attached to our discomfort. Back at the warehouse, I stapled the regional letter into my notebook beside last night's timestamp. I wrote, in the margin, measurement window, today, classification, tomorrow. Then I did what I always did when something didn't fit. I went back to work. I told myself it was routine. A little paperwork, a little walking, a few repairs before winter. Nothing heroic, nothing dramatic. On the road below, the new mesh shivered in the wind like a thin skin trying to decide what it was allowed to cover. Elena didn't come back to the village hall the way most officials did, to collect thanks or to trade promises until everyone got tired. The next morning, she went straight to the road with the engineer and the rolled plans. As if the meeting had been a formality they'd already filed. I saw her car before I saw her, a dull gray shape nosing around the bend like it was testing how much space it was allowed. The two security men were there again, keeping their hands empty and their eyes busy. The engineer carried a measuring wheel. Elena carried nothing but a phone and a folder. The folder stayed closed. The phone did most of the work. She didn't call for anyone. She didn't raise her voice. She walked. She stopped at the mesh fence, crouched, and checked one of the stakes with 2 fingers. The way you check a door frame after someone insists it won't stick. Then she stood and looked up at the slope. Not at the people watching her. At the ground. The liaison pointed when he spoke. The engineer wrote. Elena listened with the kind of attention that makes you feel your objections are already accounted for. Gianni Riva, she said when she reached me. Caretaker? The word landed like it was meant to be helpful. A roll. A box. Something to put me in. I maintain the depot, I said again, because I could feel myself shrinking into the label if I didn't resist it. She nodded, as if she'd heard a technical correction, not a refusal. Good. Then you'll understand why we can't afford improvisation. Winter load is not sentimental. If we miss the window, we don't get to choose which failures we see. The grid chooses for us. She spoke as if she'd said it many times, and that repetition had polished the edges off. A truth with no anger in it. The engineer began to measure, wheel clicking over gravel. He called numbers quietly. The liaison translated them into lines with his finger on the map. Elena's phone lit her face. She took a call without stepping away. Yes, she said, no. We're on schedule. I'm here. I'm looking at it. A pause. Wind pushed cold down the road like a hand. We are not renegotiating the scope, she said. We are managing the interface. Interface. That was what the village had become. A friction point between a plan and a place. When she ended the call, she turned back to the engineer without acknowledging the people who'd heard her. A man named Luca, who'd been loud in the hall, stepped forward and asked if the project could move the boundary back to where it had always been. He didn't threaten. He didn't plead. He asked like a neighbor asking for a gate to be closed. Elena didn't answer him directly. She looked at her folder, then at the road, then at the slope again. The boundary is not tradition, she said. It's documentation. We are aligning what exists on the ground with what exists in the registry. Aligning. As if the land had been wrong until paper corrected it. I watched the security men. They weren't braced for violence. They were braced for delay. That was the thing most people misunderstood about this kind of pressure. Nobody needed to throw a punch. They only needed to keep walking forward until you were the one who escalated. I could feel the old part of me cataloging positions. Who would run? Who would freeze? Who would shout and turn the whole thing into a story for someone else's report? So I asked my one question before I talked myself out of it. If the registry updates tomorrow, I said, "What happens to the people who stand in the wrong place before it does? It wasn't a moral speech. It was a procedural trap." And she heard it. Elena looked at me for a moment that felt longer than it was. Then she answered in the same calm voice she used for the engineer. "Then they should not stand in the wrong place," she said. "That's not punishment. It's risk management." She wasn't threatening me. She was explaining gravity. The engineer clicked his wheel again. The liaison asked someone to move back for a photograph. The security men stayed where they were. Elena wrote a short note on her phone, thumb moving fast, eyes never leaving the line. I had come down thinking there was still room to talk, still a way to find the human angle that would make the system bend. Standing there, watching her measure and call and record, I understood something simple. Elena wasn't here to talk. She was here to complete the day. By afternoon, the conflict had moved out of people's mouths and into documents, where it could do its real work. They set up in the municipal office with a folding table, a laptop, and a portable printer that sounded like an insect. Elena didn't act like the room belonged to her. She acted like time did. The liaison taped a large map to the wall. The paper curled at the corners in the damp air, and he smoothed it with his palm as if he could flatten the village into agreement. The map was simple when you stared at it long enough. A line for the road, a block for the depot, faint contour rings like fingerprints. The river down in the valley was a neat blue thread, not the thing that flooded when snowmelt got angry. Elena used a pen to point, not a finger. She didn't like skin on the paper. As if the land might stain you. "This is the easement," she said. "It's older than most of us. It allows access for maintenance and works in defined windows. The project expands within that framework. Window. Interface." The language was all architecture for the same purpose. Make resistance feel like ignorance. An older woman named Marta stood with her arms crossed and said the depot had been abandoned for a reason. The land above it had shifted before. Her brother had lost a goat in a slide 20 years ago. She spoke in the kind of detail that never made it into reports. A younger man, Davide, lowered his voice when he spoke, as if the map could hear him. He said compensation would help. He said his kids couldn't live on sentiment. He didn't look at Marta when he said it. The fracture wasn't loud. It was worse than loud. It was quiet agreement that not everyone would pay the same price. Elena listened. She kept her face neutral. If anything, she looked tired, like she'd spent years being asked to carry other people's fear without absorbing it. Then her phone rang again. She stepped toward the window, but she didn't leave the room. She didn't give us privacy. Privacy was a luxury you offered when you weren't being timed. "Yes," she said, "I'm with them now." A pause. Her jaw tightened, then relaxed. "No," she said, softly, "we don't have slack. We have compliance. Those are different things." She turned away from the window while she was still on the call, as if she couldn't afford to lose sight of the map. When she hung up, she didn't apologize for interrupting Marta's history. She returned to the paper like the call had been a weather update she needed to keep everyone alive. The engineer opened a folder and spread out a second sheet, transparent, with colored shading. It was an overlay. On it, the easement line looked thicker, more confident. It swallowed a strip of ground along the road that our eyes had always treated as shared. I leaned in, close enough to smell the printer ink. It wasn't the thickness that mattered. It was a small note in the legend, a line of text that could fit on a fingernail. "Access permitted during night work windows," it said, in plain language, like it was offering convenience. A permitted window for hours when most people slept, and when you could do things without the village collecting around you. And beneath that, another small clause, even smaller, like shame. Alternate service route authorized if primary access is impeded. I didn't need to know every road in the mountains to understand what that meant. There was an old maintenance track above the depot, half grown over, that led to the ridge. It was rough. It was steep. It existed. And it bypassed the bend where people were gathering. If the village blocked the obvious road, the project could still move. It would just move somewhere less visible. Marta was still talking. Now, about graves. About an old memorial stone near the depot wall. Davide was asking questions about payment schedules. Helena answered both with the same controlled patience, the same refusal to let emotion change the calendar. I kept my hazard notes folded in my pocket, the paper warm against my leg. The more I stared at the overlay, the more I understood the shape of the trap. The project didn't need our agreement. It only needed our fatigue. When the meeting ended, Elena rolled the maps with practiced hands and slid them into their tube, like she was putting a weapon away for later. She nodded once at the room, a gesture that could be read as respect if you wanted it to be. Outside, the light was already thinning. The mountains were still, the kind of stillness that made every sound carry. I watched Elena's car pull away. Then I looked back at the map tape residue on the office wall. A pale rectangle where paper had been. What are they allowed to do at night? I went up to the depot before anyone else could decide what the depot meant. The maintenance track was behind it, climbing into pines that had spent years reclaiming the road with needles and broken branches. In summer, it looked harmless. In winter, it was a slide waiting for weight. I didn't bring tools. I brought my notebook, my phone for photographs, and a length of chalk I used to mark bolts that had started to turn. Practical things. Things that didn't look like protest. The air smelled of wet stone. Wind scraped the metal ribs of the old warehouse roof and made it hum. The note never quite settled. I walked the perimeter the way I always did. Hinges. Locks. The generator housing. Account of what could fail. Then I followed the road down to the bend. In daylight, it was easy to pretend the slope was solid. Grass hid the seams. Small shrubs held their ground like they owned it. The rock beneath looked patient. I knew patience wasn't strength. It was time. Water ran under the surface in thin veins. Freeze and thaw did quiet damage. Weight finished it. I crouched near the ditch and pulled back a mat of leaves. The soil beneath was darker than it should have been. Wet. I pressed my thumb into it and felt it give. Under my thumb, the ground didn't just feel wet. It felt loose, as if the slope was breathing. When my boot shifted on the gravel, a dull vibration ran up my shin, the kind you felt more than heard. The drainage line that used to carry meltwater away had clogged with sediment and pine needles. I traced it with my hand, finding where it disappeared into packed debris. A truck didn't need to crash to cause harm here. It only needed to pass. If a heavy vehicle took the bend while the ground was saturated, the load would push the outer edge down. Not in a dramatic break. In settlement. In shear. A few centimeters at first. A crack you wouldn't notice until it widened. Then another truck. Then rain. Then a section of road that decided it no longer belonged to the mountain. Below the bend, a small stream ran toward the village. In dry months, it was thin as rope. In wet months, it cut. The houses nearest it were old. Stone foundations laid close to water because there was nowhere else to build. I stood and looked at the line of homes through the trees. From up here, they seemed close enough to touch. Close enough to be hurt by decisions made in an office with a printer. I photographed the ditch, the blocked drain, the soft soil. I took a picture with my boot and frame, not for drama, but for scale. Then I wrote short notes in my notebook the way I logged wind speed. Date. Time. Location. What I observed. No adjectives. No accusation. Evidence had that problem. It looked like routine until you needed it. From somewhere farther up the ridge came a sound I hadn't heard here before, a low mechanical growl, then a higher whine, like a generator being tested under load. It wasn't loud, but it carried. On the second rise, I felt it through the soles of my boots, a faint tremor, as if the mountain had taken a breath and held it. I stopped and listened until the sound cut out, then started again, then cut out. Testing. Practice. On the road, the plastic mesh fence fluttered. Someone had tightened one of the ties. Someone had been here since yesterday, adjusting the line as if it was already permanent. I could still tell myself this was none of my business. I was the caretaker. I maintained. I didn't oppose. I didn't stand in front of vans. But standing there, with mud on my fingers, hearing machinery where there had been only wind, I understood the only part that mattered. If I stayed silent, the first injury wouldn't be a moral one. It would be a person slipping, a wall cracking, a stream turning brown, a child's bus route shifting because the road shifted first. And after that, the paperwork would call it an unfortunate incident with an acceptable risk. The first thing I did was make copies. Not for courage, for sleep. I spread my notebook on the kitchen table and laid the regional letter beside it. Then the photos from the ditch. Then the screenshot of the overlay someone had forwarded into the group chat. The paper smelled faintly of printer toner and wood smoke. My hands smelled of damp soil. Outside, the wind worked its way through the valley the way it always did, testing every loose shutter and old hinge. It didn't care what the registry called the land. It cared about weight and water and time. I wrote the date in the corner of each page. I wrote the hour in words, the way you could say it aloud without stumbling. And then I took photographs of the photographs. Ridiculous. But it gave me a second set in a place that couldn't be misplaced by a helpful person with access. Piero knocked once and came in without waiting. In a village like ours, doors were more suggestion than boundary. Until they suddenly mattered. You saw it, he said. I saw the ditch. I told him. I heard the testing. He looked at the table as if the paper might bite. Elena says they'll mitigate. She says there's a process. There is a process, I said. It's just not built for our timing. He shifted his weight. Marta wants to pull the fence up tonight, and Davide wants to sign, I said, because the split had already made its own schedule. Piero's mouth tightened. So what do we do? That question was the trap. It made a plan sound like leadership. It made leadership sound like heroism. It made heroism sound like permission to ignore consequences. I had done that once. In another place. Under another flag. I didn't keep souvenirs from service. No medals on a wall. No photos in uniform. But there were still small things that refused to leave me. A habit of checking exits. A way of standing with my back near something solid. And, in the bottom of a drawer, a thin field notebook with pages the color of old bone. I pulled it out and set it beside my civilian notebook. The handwriting was mine, younger and more certain. Coordinates without context. Short lines that treated people like weather. Crowd moving left. Children at rear. Choke point at bridge. Keep gap open. It wasn't cruelty. It was procedure. The kind you use when you're told you are preventing something worse. We had called it corridor protection. In the briefing, it sounded clean. In the street, it meant telling families where they were allowed to stand while strangers measured their lives. We wore uniforms, so our authority looked obvious. The other side wore fear, so theirs looked irrational. We believed we were acting responsibly. That belief had been the dangerous part then, too. I shut the old notebook and slid it back into the drawer. Piero watched me, waiting for the version of me that would turn past skill into present power. That's not what this is, I said. More to myself than to him. I'm not doing that again. He frowned. Doing what? Letting the report write the truth, I said. The words came out flat, like a measurement. If something happens on that bend, they will describe it in a way that protects the work window. Not the people, Piero stared at the table. So we stop them. We slow harm, I said, and we record. I took a pen and drew 3 columns on a sheet of paper. Date. Who. What was seen. No speeches. No adjectives. Things you could repeat under a light without sounding like you'd rehearsed outrage. If anyone goes near the fence, I said, they don't go alone. Someone watches. Someone writes. Someone keeps hands visible. Piero's eyebrows rose. You want witnesses? I want fewer excuses. I said no bottles. No stones. No shouting that can be clipped into a story. If we stand there, we stand like people who have to live here tomorrow, he hesitated. And if they push, then we don't give them the moment they're waiting for, I said. We don't turn this into a reason for protection on their side. The sentence sounded like wisdom. It was just memory, shaped by shame. I slid 1 copy of the photos into an envelope and wrote Marta's name on it, because she would keep it out of stubbornness. I slid another into Piero's hands, because he would keep it out of fear. And you, he asked. I tapped my phone, and I keep one where it can't disappear. He let out a breath he'd been holding. You think it will get physical? I think fatigue makes people stupid, I said, and stupid is how accidents happen. When he left, my kitchen felt too quiet. I sat with the papers until the light faded and the valley turned to shadow. Before I went to bed, I wrote 1 line at the bottom of the page, under the neat columns. Keep people alive. Keep the story true. It wasn't a vow for anyone else. It was a rule for me. The blockade started as an excuse. By dawn, tractors and vans were parked where the road narrowed, not across it like a movie barricade, staggered, leaving just enough space for a person to pass and a machine to hesitate. Orange cones had been stolen from a work site. Coffee steamed in paper cups, like caffeine could keep this civil. I arrived early. Before the arguments warmed up, gravel crunched under boots. Breath showed and vanished. Marta stood near the mesh fence with her arms folded. Davide stood a few meters away, hands in his pockets, wearing the look of a man who wanted to be nowhere. A teenager held up a phone. Recording. Because recording was the only kind of protection he understood. Hands visible, I murmured to Piero when he came up beside me. No one steps forward alone. He nodded like he hated, agreeing. At 7:30, the project vehicles appeared around the bend. Slow and clean. A small truck. A van. The engineer's car. 2 security men. Elena's compact car came last, as if she preferred to see the shape of the problem before she entered it. She got out and stood still. She took inventory. Not of faces, of positions, of how much room she had, of where the slope dropped away. You're early, she said. When she saw me, we live here, I said. Her gaze flicked to the tractors. This is obstruction. This is presence, Marta called. There's a difference. Elena kept her voice aimed at the space between us, where it could pretend to be neutral. I have a permitted work window, she said, and a responsibility to meet it. If you block access, I document it and escalate. Davide cleared his throat. What about the ditch? He asked. Too softly to help. We assess when we can reach the site, Elena said. Not before. Piero shifted forward, then stopped himself. I could feel the crowd lean with him. Bodies do that when they think a single push will change a system. I lifted a hand, palm out, not at Elena, but at the people behind me. Stop. Hold. Let her say what she has to say, I said. Let the phones hear it. One of the security men walked toward the tractors, hands open, speaking calmly to the driver. The driver shook his head and stared ahead. Then the engineer tried to move past the cones to take measurements at the edge, as if work could continue around resistance. He wasn't aggressive. He was doing his job. That was the problem. Luca stepped into his path and put a hand on the measuring wheel. "Don't touch me," the engineer said. Startled, Luca's hand tightened. The wheel jerked. The engineer pulled back. A small motion, and suddenly everyone leaned in to see what it would become. I stepped between them and put my hand on Luca's wrist. Not yanking, just anchoring. I spoke close to his ear so it wouldn't perform let go. I said. Now his face was flushed. "They're taking it while we stand here," he hissed. "They're taking it on paper," I said. "Don't give them flesh." A security man reached for Luca's other arm. Phones rose higher. The security man's stance told me everything. Weight slightly on his heels. Hands open, but his elbows locked. He was trained to look harmless and move fast. I could have put him down in a second. A step in. A turn of his wrist. His balance gone. I didn't. Not with phones up. Not with Elena watching. The bruise would be mine, but the story would be theirs. The road was narrow here. The cones, the tractors, the bodies. A choke point. I widened my stance and shifted Luca half a step back. "Into air. Back," I said. To everyone. Not loud. Just firm. "Give space," Piero echoed me. 2 others did too. A chorus. Not a command. The security man hesitated. He didn't want to be the first to grab. Elena didn't want that either. Liability has a shape, and it looks like a hand on someone's shoulder in a video frame. Luca let go of the wheel. The engineer snatched it back and stepped away, breathing hard as if he'd run. No one hit anyone. No one fell. But the air had changed. The moment had been recorded. The system now had something to label. Elena looked at me, and for the first time irritation leaked through her calm. "This is exactly what I warned you about," she said. "No," I said, "this is exactly why we're here." She turned to the liaison. "Document the obstruction," she said. "Time. Names. Vehicles." The liaison began to write. On our side, the teenager with the phone panned across faces and hands. As Elena walked back to her car to make another call, I felt the shift settle in. The real fight wasn't the road. It was the report. The paperwork arrived faster than the bruise. By noon, a notice was taped to the bar door and the municipal board outside the church. It used calm words to describe a morning that had felt anything but calm. Interference. Safety risk. Temporary access restrictions for the protection of all parties. No one was accused of a crime. Everyone was warned as if we were children near a river. Elena didn't come back to argue. She sent language. The liaison returned with a clipboard and a practiced smile. He asked for names for the record, as if the record was a neutral thing that simply existed, waiting to be filled. Piero gave his name. Marta refused. David offered his without being asked. The fracture widened in small, obedient motions. That afternoon I went to the municipal office, not because I believed it would save us, but because absence was a kind of surrender. The clerk was a woman I'd known for years. She had a stack of papers on her desk and a look that said she wished none of them were there. "Gianni," she said. "Sit." I sat. I kept my hands on my knees like a child in a headmaster's office. She slid a document toward me. It wasn't a summons. It was a statement request, polite. Optional in tone. Mandatory in implication. "They want to know what happened," she said. "They want to decide what happened," I said. Her eyes flicked to the door. "Don't make it harder." I thought about the measuring wheel jerking in Luca's hand. About Elena's security man stopping himself from grabbing because he knew what a grab looked like on video. About how close the morning had come to becoming a headline instead of a warning. "I'm not making it harder," I said. "I'm making it clearer. I asked for a copy of the notice. I asked for a copy of the request. I asked, quietly, where these documents would live when the week moved on. The clerk hesitated, then told me which folder and which office cabinet. She didn't like being made complicit. None of us did. On the way out, I saw Elena in the corridor, speaking to someone on speakerphone. The voice on the phone was male, older, impatient. He didn't need to be named to have weight. "We can't afford a precedent," he said, "if they learn this works." "Every village will try it." Elena's reply was controlled. "Then we handle it inside procedure," she said. "No spectacle. No injuries. We narrow access and we keep moving." I walked past them without looking like I'd listened. Listening was my job now, even when I hated it. Back at the depot, I laid my notebook on a workbench and opened it to the columns I'd drawn. Date. Who. What was seen. I filled in the morning in short lines. The vehicles. The measuring wheel. The moment Luca's hand tightened. The exact words Elena used about escalation. I wrote down what I could prove. I left out what I only felt. Then I made the second set. I printed still frames from the teenager's video and from Piero's phone. I stamped each page with the time and date from the file properties, the closest thing we had to an honest clock. I wrote a short cover note, plain language. No accusations, only risk, slope, saturation, blocked drainage, heavy load hazard at the bend. Piero came up the hill again at dusk. His face looked older than it had yesterday. "They're saying we'll lose access to the road," he said. "They're saying the depot is now a project staging area, so you can't just walk in." "I know," I said, and showed him the printed pages. He swallowed. "What do you call this?" "Evidence. I call it something they can't pretend they didn't see," I said. He glanced toward the door, as if someone might be listening. "And if it disappears, that's why we don't keep one copy," I said. I put one envelope in Marta's hands again. I put one in Piero's. I kept one in a metal box in the depot office, the one with the bad lock that only I knew how to open without leaving marks. And I sent a set to an email account I used for maintenance invoices, because it was boring and therefore less likely to be treated as political. Still, boredom wasn't a guarantee. Helpful disappearance was a village skill. So I did the one procedural thing I could do without pretending the court would rescue us. I went back down to the municipal office, filled out the complaint form the clerk kept in the bottom drawer, and wrote one sentence in the section labeled "Supporting Materials." I used the phrase exactly the way the clerk's training manual used it, the way people with authority did when they wanted a file to stop being optional. I requested a legal hold on all related records and media. The clerk looked up at me. For a moment, she was just a woman with tired eyes. "That's serious," she said. "It's accurate," I said. She stamped the form. The stamp made a small, final sound, like a nail set into wood. When I walked back into the cold, the village looked the same. Lights in windows, smoke from chimneys, the mountains holding their shape. But the fight had changed. It wasn't about who could stand in the road anymore. It was about who could endure the paperwork long enough to keep the truth from being smoothed flat. I met the boundary at the depot gate, not at the village bend. By then, the blockade had been boiled into tidy language on a notice board, copied, photographed, forwarded. Once you put a shape on paper, people started treating it like truth. The new mesh fence was no longer just plastic and stakes. It was a paragraph. I parked my van on the gravel apron and walked to the chain across the service track. Someone had replaced my old padlock with a fresh one, bright brass, still clean enough to make your fingers smell metallic. A laminated sign hung from it, temporary access restriction, for safety, for compliance. Behind the chain, 2 contractors in reflective vests stood with clipboards. Younger than me, clean-shaven, certain. One had a radio. One held a folded map. A security man stood a few steps back, hands in front of him. watching the slope like the slope was the real threat. Elena wasn't there. She didn't need to be. "Elena Conti moved the fence," I said at once, quietly, and felt how stupid it sounded and how true it was. "This is closed," the man with the radio said. "It's my site," I said. "I maintain the generator." "If it's closed?" "It closes on someone's fingers." He glanced at the map as if my life could be verified by a line. "We have authorization," he said. "You were notified." I could have argued. Instead, I stepped closer and looked at the sign. The laminate had been punched cleanly. No ragged edges. Someone had planned for this. This is why they always preferred forms to faces. Boots crunched behind me. Marta and Piero had come up the track. Not together. Piero kept his voice down. "Gianni, the mayor says don't touch it." They're filming. I watched the contractor's eyes flick past my hands, checking for the moment he could describe later. I hadn't put a boot against Elena's fence. Not physically. "Not yet. I need to check the drain at the bend," I said, "if you want safety." "You let me do the safety work." The contractor with the map looked relieved. "We can escort you," he said, like it was a favor. The security man stepped forward. "Sir?" "You can't pass without clearance," Marta snorted. "He's been passing for 20 years. "That's not a clearance," the security man said. "Not cruel. Certain." I held up my phone. Screen lit, showing the time-stamped photos of the clogged drain. The soft soil. The boot for scale. "This is the bend," I said. "A truck will destabilize it." The man with the radio leaned in, then pulled back. "Submit it," he said. "There's a process." "My complaint asked for a legal hold," I said, and watched him flinch at the phrase, as if legality belonged only to one side. The contractor with the map pointed at the padlock. "We're not allowed," he said. "If we break protocol, it's on us." That was the moment the paper line became a lived border. Not because the chain was strong, but because 3 men with jobs had been trained to fear stepping across it more than they feared the mountain. Marta moved first. She put her fingers around the links. "This is ours," she said. Too calm. "This is where our dead are buried." The security man reacted on instinct. He took her wrist. Not hard, but enough to move it. Marta jerked back. The chain clattered. Phones lifted. The contractor with the radio took 1 step forward, then stopped himself, realizing how it would look. Everything tightened. Cold air cut my lungs. I put my hand between Marta and the security man. "Palm open. Let go," I said. Low. No one pulls. No one grabs. His fingers stayed on her sleeve for half a second longer than they should have. Then he released. Marta's arm dropped. She stared at him with the hurt pride of someone being managed. I stepped back, creating space. "We're done," I told her. Not because I wanted to leave, but because leaving was the only way to keep the scene from giving them the incident they needed. Piero guided Marta away with a hand at her elbow. The contractors watched like they'd survived something. I filmed the padlock, the sign, the men, the time. I filmed my own boots staying on the safe side of the chain. But the fight had changed. It wasn't about the fence anymore. It was about who got to decide what the fence meant. And now, with a hand on a wrist and a chain clattering on record, the system had something it could cite. The letter arrived in a plain envelope that smelled like the municipal office. Paper. Damp heat. Old ink. It wasn't addressed to my house. It was addressed to the depot. To caretaker. Site operations. As if my name was optional. I found it taped inside the warehouse door, above the logbook shelf, where it could look like a safety reminder instead of a warning. It said there would be a compliance meeting at 4. It said my presence was requested. It said the purpose was to ensure welfare and operational clarity, gentle language, sharp intent. At 3:55, I walked down to the municipal office with my notebook under my arm and my phone charged. Elena was already there, seated at the end of the table with her folder open. The liaison sat near her with a pen. The engineer was present. A security man stood by the door, not blocking it, just shrinking the room. Elena nodded once. "A timestamp, Gianni," she said. "Thank you for coming." A typed summary of incident lay in front of my chair. Calm sentences describing the depot gate, attempted interference, contact with security personnel, risk to staff welfare. It didn't mention cold air or Marta's wrist. This is why they always preferred forms to faces. Elena slid the summary toward me. "This is for your acknowledgement," she said. "Not an admission. So the depot is restricted," I said. "For everyone," Elena replied, "including you." "Temporarily, for welfare," the liaison added, as if the word could soften the lock. Elena kept her voice even. "If you need access for essential maintenance, you request it in advance. In writing, it will be scheduled." I tapped my notebook. "I submitted hazard evidence," I said. "The drain." "The bend. We received it," Elena said. "It's being assessed by who?" I asked. "By the appropriate unit," she said, and I heard the pressure under it. "Keep it inside lanes." I kept my voice low. "You're using a half-second at a chain as justification." Elena didn't deny it. "You created visibility," she said. "Visibility creates obligations." "I have obligations, and I have obligations," I said, hating the truth of it. Elena folded her hands. "Your complaint asked for a legal hold," she said. "Careful with the phrase, 'that escalates this.' It triggers preservation. It also triggers review." "So you're reviewing me," I said. "We're reviewing the interaction," Elena corrected, "and your role. You are a caretaker, not a stakeholder. If you act outside that role, you expose yourself and others. Once you put a shape on paper, people started treating it like truth. Today, the shape was my name inside a folder." Elena turned her laptop slightly. I didn't need to read the details to recognize the headings. Conduct. Access. Compliance. "I'm offering you a safer path," she said. Softer now. "Submit your evidence through the channel. Stop placing yourself at barriers. Let the process work process. Work." Words that sounded like care until you felt how they narrowed you. It wasn't about the fence anymore. It was about who got to decide what the fence meant, I said, and watched her eyes flicker, annoyed that I'd said it aloud. Elena leaned back. "And the system decides," she said. "Not as a threat. As a fact." The clerk slipped in a second document, an instruction to refrain from approaching restricted areas without permission. Direct all concerns through municipal channels. Further interference would be recorded as non-compliance. No statute numbers, just consequences. At the bottom was a blank line for my signature. Elena watched me. "Signing doesn't mean you agree," she said. "It means you understand the conditions. It protects everyone. Protects." The same word that could mean opposite things depending on who held the pen. I signed. Then I took a photograph of the signed page before anyone could file it away. Elena didn't stop me. She couldn't. The record was the battlefield now. When I left the office, the village looked unchanged, but people's eyes didn't sit on me the same way. I was no longer background. I walked back up to the depot and stopped at the locked gate. The padlock gleamed. The laminated sign fluttered slightly in the wind. The line on the map had become hardware, and my name was now in the file in a new way, not as caretaker, but as risk. I didn't wait for permission to disappear. The afternoon after the compliance meeting, I went back up to the depot with the signed page photographed in my phone, and the padlock still gleaming like a warning. I let myself in the only way left to me, through my own records. I opened the logbook shelf, pulled out the metal box, and laid everything out on the workbench under the strip light. Photos of the ditch, Photos of the blocked drain, the bend from 3 angles, the soft shoulder where the gravel gave, the new mesh fence, the padlock, the laminated sign, the timestamp from the file properties, names I could verify and names I couldn't. A simple witness list, not a parade of accusations. Just who stood there, who spoke, who touched what, and when. The evidence looked small when it was quiet. That was always the temptation. In a meeting room, a problem expands. On a bench, it shrinks into paper and pixels and something you can pretend will be handled later. I had learned, years ago, that later was a weapon. I made 3 sets. One printed set went into a plain envelope for Marta, because she didn't fear paperwork and she didn't trust screens. One set went to Piero, because he did fear paperwork and still needed something he could touch when he started to doubt himself. The 3rd set was for the world outside our valley, the part that could look at a regional project without needing to win an argument at the bar. I didn't send it to anyone glamorous. I sent it to the regional ombudsman's office, to the address listed on a government site in a PDF nobody read unless they were desperate. I wrote a short cover note in plain language. No rage. No speeches. Just hazard. Access restriction. And the fact that the site caretaker had been formally limited from performing safety checks. Then I sent a second copy to a civic safety NGO that took complaints about infrastructure risks. Their form asked for categories. I chose slope instability and restricted access to mitigation. I attached the photos and the log. I used the same timestamps. I made it boring on purpose. Inside the system, I triggered the part that couldn't be quietly smoothed away. I went back down to the municipal office before closing and asked the clerk to register an addendum to my existing complaint, the one that already carried the words I'd forced myself to use. My complaint asked for a legal hold. I added 1 paragraph. I referenced the compliance meeting, the access restriction, the incident summary, and the fact that essential maintenance access now required advanced scheduling. I attached the photographed signature page and the depot padlock photo. I asked that the addendum be logged under the same file and stamped the same day, and that the legal hold apply to it as well. The clerk's pen hovered over the stamp. Her eyes flicked up. "Gianni," she said quietly. "This is going to land on you. It's already landing on me," I said. She stamped it anyway. A small, final sound. Another nail. When I walked back into the corridor, Elena was there, not waiting for me like a villain, just present, like she belonged to the building and the building belonged to procedure. She held her folder against her ribs, and her expression was the same one she wore when she read maps, calm enough to be mistaken for kindness. "You're escalating," she said. "I'm recording," I answered. She studied my face the way she had studied the slope, looking for the point that would fail. "You sent it outside," she said. Not as a question. I didn't confirm it. I didn't deny it. Denial was useless now. Elena's jaw tightened once, then eased. "You understand what this does," she said. "It creates a file. It triggers review. It pulls attention. It pulls attention to the bend," I said. "It pulls attention to you," she corrected, "and to the municipality, and to the project, and to the village. You're making everyone into a liability." Her words weren't cruel. They were the language of someone who had been taught to keep a system moving by translating people into risk. I felt the old urge to justify myself, to explain my conscience, to win an argument. Instead, I asked one practical question, the kind that still fit in her world. "If a truck takes that bend and the road shifts," I said, "what will your file call it?" Elena blinked once. "Slow. We mitigate verified hazards," she said. "We don't negotiate under obstruction, and we don't get verification without access," I said. For a moment, The corridor felt too narrow. The clerk behind the desk pretended to be invisible. The building hummed with fluorescent light. Elena turned her folder slightly, so I could see the top sheet. A new notice. A new shape on paper, effective immediately, she said. Voice level. Your access to the depot is revoked unless explicitly scheduled under supervision. Your caretaker contract will be reviewed. Until that review concludes, you are not authorized to perform unsupervised work on the restricted site. The consequence was quiet. No raised voice. No dramatic removal. Just a door that no longer opened. I stared at the words until they stopped looking like letters and started looking like weight. Once you put a shape on paper, people started treating it like truth. Now the shape was me. Reduced to not authorized. Elena lowered the folder. I'm not doing this to punish you, she said. I'm doing it to contain damage. I almost laughed. Contain. The same word you used for a spill and for a man. I nodded once. Not agreement. Just acknowledgement. Then we're clear, I said. I walked out into the cold with my hands empty and my pockets full of copies. On the steps, Piero was waiting. His face held that mixture of fear and hope people wear when they want someone else to make the next move. What did she do? He asked. I looked past him at the road, at the valley, at the place where the fence line cut through our days. She made it easier to hate me, I said. And I wasn't sure whether that was her intention or the only kind of protection the system could offer. A year later, the fence was still there. It wasn't the same mesh. The new one was heavier, with posts sunk deeper and wire that didn't sag after a storm. It looked permanent in the way paperwork always wanted to look. The mountain didn't care about that. It cared about what held, and what didn't. The depot sat above the village like a sealed memory. I didn't have keys to it anymore. Not the way I once did. The caretaker contract had ended quietly in a letter that thanked me for my service and reminded me of my obligations. The word obligations showed up everywhere once you were in the file. I still worked near the system. Not on the ridge. Not on the chain. In a small office behind the municipal building, where the maps lived. The clerk called it record support. I scanned documents. I sorted folders. I made sure the right things stayed findable when someone decided they needed them. It wasn't a promotion. It was containment that happened to suit my habits. In the first weeks, people looked at me like I had brought trouble home on purpose. Marta kept nodding at me as if nodding could substitute for apology. Piero stopped inviting me to the bar. Davide avoided my eyes entirely, then one day thanked me in a whisper for the compensation package his family took, like gratitude was contraband. The outcome was mixed, the way it always is when nobody is allowed to win cleanly. There was money, yes. Not enough to heal pride. Enough to buy silence for some people. Bitterness stayed. People still argued about whether the project had saved us from winter outages or stolen something you couldn't price. But there were changes you could touch. At the bend, the clogged drain had been rebuilt. New culverts ran under the road. Concrete collars, clean and obvious. A small sensor post stood in the soil above the shoulder. A thin metal stake with a box on top, humming quietly. On the roadside, a sign warned of slope monitoring and heavy load restrictions during thaw. The language was bland. The effect was real. Sometimes, early in the morning, I drove up just to look at it. Not to feel righteous. To confirm that the hazard had been acknowledged by something other than my memory. The village still split, but it split around new facts. That mattered. One afternoon in late autumn, a younger maintenance worker was assigned to help me move a set of archived files into a new cabinet. He was broad-shouldered in the way boys are before the body teaches them limits. He handled folders like they were dead weight, impatient with paper. He glanced at a map on the table and laughed under his breath. All this for a line, he said. I didn't correct him. I watched his hands. He stacked pages without checking dates. He assumed order was automatic. I slid the map closer and pointed with my pen, not my finger. The habit's still intact. This is the bend, I said. See, that little mark? That's the sensor. I tapped the corner where a notation had been added in small print, and this is the restriction they didn't want to write at first. He leaned in. Curiosity replaced boredom. Why does it matter? He asked. I opened the hazard log instead of answering. The columns were still there. Date. Time. Location. Observation. I set the book in front of him. I placed the pen on the page. He stared at it for a second too long, as if waiting for the paper to speak first. Then he picked up the pen. He wrote one line. Crooked. Careful. The date. The bend sensor humming like he was testing whether words could hold weight. When he finished, he didn't look at me. He just slid the log back, quietly, as if he'd understood something and didn't want to name it out loud. That evening, after the building emptied, I stayed a few minutes longer. The office was quiet in the way offices are when they stop performing. I walked to the shelf where the depot maps and the hazard logs sat in their labeled folders. I checked the cabinet lock. Old habit. Then I left the small desk lamp on above the shelf, not as a gesture, as a practical decision. In the dark, the light made a square on the labels and the edges of the files. I left it on.